Acts 7:30 through 32. Now, again, this is continuation of Stephen's sermon. He's telling them about Moses in the past few verses, about what Moses' part in history. This is just a reminder for them, but what he's doing is showing that God's plan was working even in the time of Moses till the time of Christ. The same one Jesus is the same one Moses went to and served. 40 years later, this is talking about after he killed the man, after he left Egypt, 40 years after this. So he's, I believe based on what the scripture says, he's 80 at the time. Yes, he's 80 now. So he's 40 years older. He killed a man 40 years ago. Now he's a little wiser. He's been living in the wilderness. We see how the wilderness, we see how Jesus spent time in the wilderness. We see how the Egyptians wandered through the wilderness. We see how David often did his shepherding out in a wilderness type area. There's a lot of mentions of God's people in wilderness throughout Scripture. In the desert near Mount Sinai, an angel appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush. Now, Mount Sinai, there's the area around this it was full of desert. There's very few places, and so he would have been wandering around as a shepherd from place to place to find grass for his sheep to eat, or don't know necessarily. It tells, I think in Exodus it tells he was guarding sheep, but so they would have been wandering from place to place. They may have not stayed in the same area because most likely they would have been in a place that had grass. So most likely this translation desert is more of a wilderness, more of because they would have been grass for him to wander there with his sheep. They may have not been much, but it would have been enough for his sheep to go about. Now in today's time, this area is nothing but desert. Now, we see how this is a symbol of God, the fiery bush. Mentions how an angel appeared here. We don't see that in Exodus. But we see how it's God speaking to him. So Stephen's bringing forth new information here by saying that an angel appeared. Yeah. Verse 31. Moses saw it and wondered what it was as he ran to see the voice of the Lord and called out to him. Okay, one note in Exodus that it doesn't really make mention of here. The reason Moses notices this bush is because it's on fire, but nothing's burning. We see how sometimes fire is a symbol for God. We see how they had a pillar of fire guide them by night. So we see how that's symbolic of God's presence. So he just goes over to notice it, and that's when God speaks to him, tells him take off his sandals because it's holy ground because of God's presence. Sometimes God has to do amazing, different things to catch our attention. Things out of our normal, oftentimes, to get our attention. Sometimes it's tragedy. Sometimes it's just simple differences. Sometimes it's somebody unexpected telling us something that if it would have been somebody else, we wouldn't have listened to. But God has his ways to get our attention, and he got Moses' attention by this burning bush. He has to get our attention sometimes because we're not open to listen. We need to be in a place where we're open to listen. But if we're not, and he has a message for us, he's going to get our attention. And he does that with Moses here. I am the God of your ancestors, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses shook with terror and dared not look. Okay, we see how later um, Moses desires to see God's face. But oftentimes that shows how his closeness with God developed over the years. Became more personal. But this was a common reaction to not only God, but to angels. There was always a fear, because usually the person was unworthy, didn't feel worthy. And Moses was in a place where he wasn't truly living out service to the Lord. And oftentimes we see in the New Testament how angels appeared to men and their immediate response was fear. God don't want us to be fearful of Him when He shares a message with us. He wants us to be attentive and serving. And that's what He'd expect out of Moses, for him to be serving and attentive. Now, sometimes if we should have a fear for the Lord, but more of a respect. As Christians, we should be more of a respect, because we've already accepted Christ, so we're not going to face the judgment. Now, if we're not living right, there may be a reason to fear. But ultimately, anything He's going to do for us and to us as Christians is to draw us back to Him, because He loves us. The view of God was different at this point in time. So there was a fear. Today, we know God died for us. And if we're submitting to Him, there shouldn't be that fear there anymore. But there should always be a reverence.